Good morning, and perhaps good afternoon to some. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Confederation of Asia Pacific Chambers of Commerce and Industry, I would like to welcome all of you to today's webinar on Incoterms 2020. Thank you very much for participating in this important capacity building activity. Let me also convey my deep appreciation to Mr. Pavel Andrle, our resource experts, for joining us today. I'm sure we all look forward to hearing his views and learn from his expertise on the webinar topic. CACCI is indeed pleased to co-organize the webinar with Mr. Pavel Andrle. We believe sessions like this one provide an excellent forum not only for networking among businessmen and bankers in the region, but more importantly, for learning and acquiring new skills. We in CACCI recognize that today, more than ever, providing our members and associates with the opportunity to continuously train and upgrade their expertise should be one of the priority services of the Confederation. As you are well aware, the business and the banking sectors today face many challenges arising from trends and developments that have been making a major impact on the way business is done, especially in the area of international trade. I therefore hope you will take an active part in the discussion and share your views on the issues at hand. In closing, let me reiterate my words of appreciation to the participants for your support of the webinar. I trust that with the new skills and knowledge you will acquire from the session, you will be in a better position to help your respective organization forge ahead in today's market environment. I also wish to convey my gratitude to our speakers, Mr. Pavel Andrle, for taking time out of his busy schedule to join us today and to share his valuable knowledge and expertise on issues surrounding the webinar theme. I'm sure that your presentation will help our participants gain a better understanding of the various topics covered by today's discussion. Thank you, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ernst, for your opening remarks, and great thanks to you and your colleagues in Confederation for long-term great support. We have done many seminars until now, and I'm pleased and very honored to be again your guest speaker for today's webinar. Most certainly, it would be much nicer pleasure for all of us if we meet in one room and debate all these issues face to face. It would be a nice social event as well, but of course, still we cannot do it. So hopefully this platform using Zoom will allow us to do our best and cover the topics and have some nice debates and questions and answers sessions, and maybe some follow-up. I'm always available. My emails, contact details are always given to participants for follow-up. So I wish to keep in touch with you, and I do with many participants of my events worldwide. I hope you see me and hear me well. I hope it's the case. Can you confirm that I'm well on the air? And we can start the session as such. So I very much hope all is fine. You are all seated in your home office or in your work office and watching our TV, our screen. And I wish to welcome you once more to our webinar on international trade, in particular rules and practices in relation to delivery trade terms. As I already stated, I'm really pleased to do another session with great support from CACCI. Thanks to CACCI and my organization ICC, I visited many countries, including countries from you, dear participants, are from. My first session, if I'm not mistaken, was in 2007 with CACCI. I think it was in Mongolia, and since many sessions in Philippines, in Iran, and Vietnam, and Sri Lanka, Mongolia again, have been done successfully. You will, I'm sure, you have already this question in your mind. You will receive a PDF presentation later, so you will also see my contact details. And as I said, you are very welcome to send me any inquiries, remaining questions in future. Maybe a few words about myself. Many of you already know me well. As you see me on this picture, very active trainer and consultant in trade finance. I am also very much associated with ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, and I was one of the guys who helped to set up the National Committee in 1999 in Czech Republic. I'm a member of Banking Commission and Commission on Commercial Law and Practice, which actually developed these Incoterms rules we will focus on today. As a trainer and consultant, of course, I cooperate with many national committees of ICC, chambers of commerce, various organizations, associations, training centers of banks, but also companies in logistics and cargo insurance, freight forwarders, because all these people, of course, are and must be interested in international rules and practices we all use to avoid problems, disputes, to set up our contracts in nice and clear manner. I've done a lot of events also with some developing organizations and banks in particular, such as IFC, EBRD, which is covering a big part of Asia, Central Asia. Of course, Asia Development Bank is well known to you, and I recently also done a lot of work in Africa in cooperation with development banks there. Myself, I am not only ICC man. ICC is my kind of base, if you wish, but not employment. I am owner of trade finance consultancy company, and here you might have a look on my website if you wish. So all is said. I believe you hear me and see me well, so I can continue. And once more, we very appreciate your attendance of this webinar in your mostly afternoon times. Thank you so much. If I'm not mistaken, we have many participants from Mongolia. Welcome. Iran, Vietnam, Philippines, and maybe somebody else from some other countries. So all you are all very welcome. Firstly, of course, I will do a lot of speech, and of course, firstly, I wish to focus on a general but very important and practical remarks in relation to international trade as such, to get into environment in which Incoterms are set and implemented. The main part would be on, of course, each and every Incoterm, and we should very much focus, as I know many of you are bankers, but even if you are not, you are very much interested how it works with other conditions of contract, payment terms in particular. So I will very much focus on documentary evidence, which is a key in relation to key payment instrument used in our regions, documentary credits. So here the relationship is indeed quite often very challenging. So we need to think about what is obligation of the seller, exporter under contract, under Incoterm, and what letter of credit is asking for, or should ask for, so exporter is comfortable in actually making these conditions, fulfilling these conditions, and getting paid. So these are our themes. As I said, firstly, me talking and you hopefully listening and making maybe some notes, but don't worry, what you see, you will get. So make notes on things which are not on slides. And then we plan a question and answer session at the end. So please, during the time, use chat or preferably this question and answer feature of our Zoom platform, and raise your questions so I can look at them and cover at the end. So that's the plan. Unfortunately, the event cannot be as interactive as usually my face-to-face seminars are, but we can do our best, and let's try. So first thing first, a bit of introduction to international trade as such. So we have seller and the buyer, and of course they should very much consider the objectives and the risks, and negotiate contract in nice and clear manner. And of course, objective of the seller is to sell, but not only to sell, of course, primary objective is to get paid in time. And quite often, of course, exporter is looking for long-term relationship, a buyer, agent, distributor in the foreign country with whom it can have long-term profitable relationships. So this would be kept in mind. And on the other hand, buyer certainly wants to receive goods, but the right goods in the right quality, quantity, with all these characteristics and in time. And most certainly, again, looking for a reliable supplier, with which whom it can work in long term. So it very much matters. I know today quite often there are auctions and so on, so it can be one-off transaction, but mostly we are looking really for long-term relationships, which certainly is the main goal of that contract and a relationship to start with. If this a bit of exaggeration, I can say as a seller that any delivery of the goods until I'm paid is a gift. So when we think about the risks, the main risk is I'm not going to be paid. I will have the loss in every manner. Of course, bigger loss when I deliver and payment is not done in the right time or at all over and so on. So I need to think about that. This is the main risk. And of course, a similar buyer, any payment until I receive the right goods is a donation. So basically, if I pay in advance, I'm from that moment, I'm really having big risk on my shoulders. So I will try to mitigate that or find some other agreement condition. A few words on the risk. Generally, I think really we should see the risk a bit widely. So if you are a seller, certainly your risk is your own internal operational risk. You will, or I will mess it up. I'm not able to actually produce the goods in the right time. There will be some errors, mistakes in documentation and so on. So basically, of course, I need to have the right management, the right people, the right operational procedures and so on. Of course, then when it comes to export, to fulfill my obligations in relation to delivery and so on, delivery of documents and so on, I will use other parties, third parties, and I will quite often have a risk. Of course, I will have the risk they will not fulfill my instructions, the contracts I have with them, and so on. So to some extent, this risk is under my control because I have a legal relationship with them. But of course, the control is rather limited, and sometimes certainly buyer should think about that, but seller as well. Sometimes other party buyer might do something at my risk. So then I have that risk, which is not really under my control, but at my risk. So I should really think about that. And there is big group of let's say external risks which I do not control, like force majeure, governmental actions and so on, sanctions, embargoes and so on. And of course, depends on the contract. These external risks might be mine or the buyers. And anyway, I would be, or the other party would be responsible, even if we cannot fulfill our obligations, if such an action materializes. Of course, we can have exemptions from our contracts. So I should think about that. I should think about force majeure clauses, hardship clauses, which should cover me against this and exempt me from these liabilities I would otherwise have. This is huge risk, which I cannot control at all, but I can reduce or eliminate my liability responsibility for this. So these are my internal or external risks. And of course, I have risks of my counterparty, the buyer. His internal risks, his external, but under its control because he has legal relationships with them. And of course, buyer would have a lot of external risks like force majeure and so on its shoulders. This is his risk, but his risk is my counterparty risk, indirect risk. So I have risk that he would not be able to fulfill its obligations because of these risks, basically, and I might be in a big trouble. So this is certainly something I need to cope with. And of course, I often use some tools such as guarantees and insurance and so on to mitigate these risks as above all counterparty risks. And then I have the risk that maybe the bank or maybe the insurance company will not be able to fulfill their obligations, or there will be bankruptcy. So there were some errors in the documentation, or also some disputes. So I should always think about choosing the right party and having the right conditions. So certainly, risk is very wide, very broad area, and most certainly we can only mitigate or rightly distribute these risks. They will be always there. From the buyer's side, I would look at this issue more or less from the same angle. So again, my internal risks, my own operational obligations, and so on. But then, of course, I use a lot of parties to deliver goods to me and insure goods and so on. So I have these obligations, and as well external risks outside my control, which would be my big trouble unless I am exempted from this impact of this. But the right condition in the contract is there to exempt me vis-a-vis the buyer. And of course, again, facing seller's risk, performance risk, non-delivery, non-fulfillment of quality and so on requirements can be mitigated by performance guarantees and so on. So again, the risk of the issuer of such a guarantee, conditions of the guarantee, enforcement, and so on. So this is important. Between seller and the buyer, if we ask the question, who is responsible, whose obligation it is, who is in the trouble, it can be only seller or the buyer. Okay. Even if the carrier cannot deliver the goods, or there is some error here and there on the other parties, also at the end, it is a seller's or buyer's liability responsibility, which certainly can, based on their contracts with third parties, try to claim indemnities and so on. But that's not the issue for the other party. Maybe spending a few more words on risks in a bit more narrow context sense. Of course, exporter's main risk it faces is the payment risk and possibly bank risk if that payment risk of the buyer is covered by letters of credit or guarantees. Country risk, which includes economical, political, but also I would say legal risk of abuse or use abuse of, let's say, legal system, injunctions and so on. So one should really look at this, and we need information, okay, to assess that risk. Depends on the region. But certainly we have a lot of organizations like Dun & Bradstreet, which provide useful information about financial side of the company. And maybe even better source would be these insurance companies, which cover trade insurance risks, trade risk, payment risk, basically, credit insurance. They are active in many developed and, let's say, less developed countries like Coface, Atradius, Credento. So they are certainly active in many countries you are from, or if you are exporter and selling to France and so on, certainly this would be a great resource of information, and possibly also the mitigation insurance. When it comes to bank risk, how to assess the bank risk, of course, our bank can help us, but I would certainly recommend, of course, using these rating agencies and so on. So bankers would have access to the almanac and so on to see the ratings if the bank has. And I wish to recommend, having the experience with developing banks, It really helps to see if the bank which issues LC, maybe from say Mongolia or Zambia or Bolivia or Cambodia, whether this bank is actually part of trade facilitation program, basically whether a developing bank accepted their risk, they gave them credit line to support trade finance. So a lot of banks have that support, which really allows, when using this, to have LCs issued by these banks confirmed. So developing banks, they have on their websites lists of issuing banks for which they have credit lines, which banks they accepted credit risk. And of course, this gives me a good comfort. I know that maybe ADB, gave credit line to this bank from Vietnam, and IFC as well. So I see they are well vetted. They are well accepted. They know what they are doing. Developing banks not only give them credit lines, but also trainings and so on. So that helps. And when it comes to country risk, again, rating agencies, but I also wish to highlight the big part of that is compliance risk, issues of sanctions and so on. So we have some resources where to see how the country is actually kind of rated when it comes to the financial risk as such. Again, insurance companies, brokers like AON. In Africa, there is a really great company focusing on these political economical risks, really watching this, and we can get their information usually for some fee which is well paid for. So risks play a big role, and certainly we should not only think about making money and cutting costs, but really having not too risky transactions, well balanced and well secured. The buyer is, of course, facing above all counterparty risk, performance risk of the seller. So again, we need to assess that. It's good to visit and get information from that territory, visit chambers of commerce and other organizations they are members of, get some information about them, about their track record. A lot of companies, buyers, they try to learn about other customers of our potential sellers to see what experience they have with that particular seller supplier. Is this first transaction you have for export to Nigeria, or do you have already some customers in Nigeria or in Ghana? Can I talk to them? Can I see how it works? So indeed, some collection of information so we can have learned decisions are needed. So again, don't think only about making money. Yes, profit, cutting cost makes sense to some extent, but we should not cut corners and really undergo too many risks without mitigation and good decisions made. Jumping into export or import transaction, of course, we know how challenging it is. Exporter would have to produce the goods and pack them and mark them, label them. There will be export clearance. There will be some pre-carriage. There will be the main transport, the main carriage. There will be transshipment, ongoing carriage to the buyer's warehouse. There will be import clearance in a buyer's country or so. So many activities, so many obligations need to be done by somebody, seller or the buyer. So we need to have contracts, clear agreements, and we need to know, it needs to be clearly decided who does what, who will arrange for export clearance or import clearance, who will arrange for transport, for insurance, if that's the case, for inspection on sellers or buyers side? Who will do that? Who will arrange? Who will be responsible for contracting for it? Seller or the buyer? Then, of course, who will pay for it? Who will pay to the service provider for transport? Who will pay for insurance, for inspection? Seller or the buyer? Not necessarily who will arrange, also pays the cost of this. For instance, a seller can contract for the carriage. He can pay for the carriage, or the buyer consignee would be required to pay for the carriage freight at the destination. So we have various combinations. Yeah. Of course, for the buyer, I would say it's not really, the main question is not really who pays, because finally you always pay as a buyer. But the question is, what is your budget? What is better for you? If the seller pays and he will invoice it and pass the cost to you with maybe some margin, some markup, or what if you pay for that service directly to this service provider? What is better? What is cheaper? What gives you more control over that activity? So buyer really should think, is it better if the seller does it at my cost directly or indirectly, or if I do it at my own cost? And of course, who has the risk of that action, of that transport, of that inspection or so? So not necessarily who arranges also pays and has the risk of that action, if you wish. So there are various combinations available, and this needs to be clear from the contract. Of course, Incoterms give us answers to great extent in relation to delivery of the goods, but not everything is covered there, and sometimes we need to modify, we need to change it. So make sure you always know, when you look at the contract, the answers to these three questions. So we need to decide where the risk in relation to delivery, transport risk, passes from the seller to the buyer. So we are talking about transfer of delivery, transport risks, not all the risks, as we already know. So where seller needs to deliver, where his delivery obligation is to be fulfilled, from which place the buyer takes over, and of course, to which place the seller is responsible for the cost. And we need to be clear in a pretty good detail, including loading, unloading, transshipping costs. So who is responsible? Who is paying for that? Who has the risk in relation to delivery? That would be our main focus. Contract of sale, of course, should be a result of well thought through negotiation, thinking about costs and risks and all of that. And on one side, it's of course obligations and rights to get the counter value, so sellers to deliver in time or perform, and a right to be paid. And of course, buyer has obligation to take up goods without delay. Yeah, so that's also important. And sometimes buyers, they kind of delay taking over the goods. There is escalating cost, and the risk will pass to them prematurely. So they should really know and make sure they don't delay receipt of the goods. And of course, they need to pay in time. We should not forget, quite often, seller needs assistance, help, documentation, and so on from the buyer to fulfill his obligations. And the buyer needs information from the seller, documents to be able to clear goods for import, to arrange for insurance, and so on. So basically, there needs to be cooperation, assistance. Incoterms, to some extent, cover that in relation to delivery, but we need to put more flesh on it, more details, how exactly, by email, by fax, what information should be there given to the buyer, so buyer can arrange for taking the goods, for instance, or how and when buyer is to inform the seller about exact time and place of delivery, either FCA terms or so. So this is a lot of problems happen just because of lack of communication and help and assistance from the other party. So quite often one party relies on the other, so they can fulfill their obligations. So this is also quite often underestimated. So important to highlight this. With this slide, I wish to highlight importance of really thinking well who will do what, who will clear the goods for export, for import, who will contract for the carriage, either seller or the buyer, but they should decide based on who can do it more efficiently, cheaply, who can control that better. So it would be most likely unwise quite often if the export clearance is to be done by the importer or import clearance by exporter, because they might have big problem to fulfill this. When it comes to transport, ideally seller or the buyer contracts for the whole multimodal warehouse to warehouse transport to have one carrier responsible for the whole thing. And of course, because of economies of scale, hopefully getting better price. But it depends. Sometimes we need to kind of divide part of transport by the seller, part of import, part of the transport by the buyer. And then we need to make sure that our freight forwarders somehow cooperate. There is good cooperation because there will be transshipment in the way. So basically, firstly, we should gather information from freight forwarders, banks, chambers, customs, and then deciding very clearly who will do what, who will pay, who has the risk. This would be reflected in contract of sale, which is the master contract. And based on this, either seller or the buyer would have the risks of these third parties, as we already discussed. Payment, how payment is to be done, in advance or after delivery or by documentary collection, again, documents which evidence seller shipped the goods, by letter of credit against documents, which ideally, again, reflect that seller shipped the right goods, deliver them as per Incoterm. And especially this letter of credit, the problem is that quite often letter of credit is actually, let's say, execution of the contract of sale payment condition. So between seller and the buyer, letter of credit is part of their relationship. It's fulfillment or not fulfillment of that contract condition, payment condition. But then when else is issued, from the banker's point of view, it is independent, for they don't care about the contract it comes from. So quite often LC is problematic, might not actually reflect, comply with the contract terms, or contract was very vague, not precise. So honestly, most disputes in relation to letters of credit based on arbitration and court decisions and so on I've seen, big part of them is actually about whether LC, letter of credit, actually complies with the contract or not. Mostly it is actually a dispute between seller and the buyer, not between seller and the bank. Yeah. So make sure letter of credit is well described in the contract, and the letter of credit clearly says, contract says, which documents are to be presented on the letter of credit with which conditions. Not all documents sellers to give to the buyer should be requested by the letter of credit, and of course need to be well precise in the contract. So we know how the LC should look like. So this is really a problematic area in practice. Of course, we should have good contracts, and it's a good idea to use standards established in our industries. So very briefly, of course, parties needs to be identified, goods described well, precisely, quantity, quality, norms, and so on. Price, what is included in the price? Does it include also taxes and so on? If inspection is mandatory, of course, Incoterms will decide who is responsible for it. If it's not mandatory, requested by governments of sellers or buyers country, then it would be buyer's requirement, and contract should say where and by whom the inspection is to be organized. And of course, other conditions like timing for the delivery, the place of delivery, which means transfer of delivery transport risks, and when buyer becomes owner of the goods, and many other conditions in relation to clearance, payment, documents to be presented by the seller to the buyer. Some of them may be under letter of credit. Sellers, warranties, guarantees, liabilities in relation to deliver the goods, maybe some limits for the buyer to raise arguments, complaints. This is very important. Limitation of liability in case of non-delivery or insufficient quality of the goods. Very important for the seller not to be liable for, without any limits, vis-a-vis buyer's losses. Maybe some formulas how to calculate damages, liquidated damages, having these formulas. So this is all very important, including having exemptions in case of these external risks we cannot control, such as frustration, force majeure situations. And of course, we should think about, if there is a dispute, how amicably and quickly solve it. Maybe mediation, maybe arbitration, maybe court, and which law, of course, covers our relationship, our contract. And contract should be drafted in that frame. So the law is important. Not all conditions might be enforceable under each and every law. So all of this is important. And today we will mostly, of course, focus on delivery obligation. I need to highlight, and I will again later, importance of fixing transfer of ownership. Delivery means seller delivers and buyer becomes now at the risk and at a position of goods, but not necessarily he is also owner, legally speaking, of the goods. So delivery does not equal transfer of ownership. So remember, Incoterms don't cover ownership, transfer of ownership from the seller to the buyer. So contract should say when buyer becomes owner of the goods, on delivery or only after he or she pays full invoice price, or maybe on some other condition. So contract should say, otherwise the law would cover it, and laws might differ, so there might be surprises. So remember, contract should clarify this: clearance, and of course conditions in relation to deliveries, documents. This is our focus, and to some extent we will also make remarks in relation to payment conditions. Above all, documentary credits, documents to be requested under them. Useful tools we can choose from. Many organizations, and ICC is maybe one of the most active, develop for their members and wider community model contracts. So remember, ICC developed a very nice and simple model contract for sale, which has general conditions part and then specific conditions in relation to our transaction. It is intended for mainly SMEs, smaller companies, which don't have time and money to spend for lawyers to develop detailed contracts. So this is good starting point, and it's for manufactured goods intended for resale, not really for kind of long-term agency distributorship relationships, but kind of nice, simple one-off also contract of sale. So this is good. A publication with explanation and so on, based on Vienna UN Convention, which many countries you are from. I would assume most likely all countries you are from ratified. So this is something we use big way. But I wish to recommend also, I've done some work with ITC, which is organization set up by UN and World Trade Organization. These great guys also developed excellent model contracts for sale with good legal information, and some of these can be obtained for free. ICC publications, most of them are for some fee, but not all. So keep looking for this. I know in reality, I know often I hear, Paul, this is very good advice, but in my environment, quite often we don't have detailed contracts which would cover all of this, which is a bit unfortunate. Sometimes there's just inquiry, offer, profit by invoice, purchase order, maybe some links to general conditions for sale, so which might be conflicting with general conditions of the other party, to which there could be reference as well. And then maybe letter of credit. Quite often, letter of credit basically is the main and the only one real coverage of contractual agreement, if you wish, which is very, very unfortunate. So I would certainly recommend to have good, but maybe simple, but good 1, 2, 3 pages contract to cover, to actually have clarity on our agreement. We should not see it as a kind of tool to fight with the other party and go to the court and get compensation, which certainly should work for as well, but mainly to prevent problems, disputes. If we know what we agree, then if it's clarified, then of course the likelihood of problems, disputes, it's much lower. So I wish to kind of pray for having clear contracts in place. Quite often, it doesn't really cover well selected law and dispute resolution. When LC is or guarantee is requested, quite often it is not well described, clearly described. So quite often there are big disputes, as I said, whether LC actually is in line with our agreement, if the agreement was not clear enough, or unfortunately LC has some other conditions. Must seller accept them, or he can actually cancel the contract and get out of it? So this is problematic unless we pay attention. So this is the first part. And I hope we set the scene for further discussions on Incoterms, and now we have the mind ready to kind of streamline our focus on delivery terms, but understanding it is in that environment, in that context between seller and the buyer, and they need to assume and well choose their parties, because failure of the carriers and inspectors and insurance companies or whatever, banks to issue LCs and so on, would be their failure. Between seller and the buyer, the answer, who is responsible, can be only seller or the buyer. That's the main message. Sometimes we say, yeah, carrier is responsible. Okay, but it means that maybe seller can claim from the carrier or buyer can claim from the carrier. Between seller and the buyer, it is only sellers or buyers' obligation, and then they can possibly have some recourse to their parties they basically obtained services from. So I very much hope everybody could follow me well, no problems. Can I have some feedback from somebody so I'm comfortable? All good? Let me start the second and the main presentation on Incoterms in particular. All good. Yes. Thank you, my dear colleagues and friends, for your feedback in chat. I don't have the pleasure to see your faces and read from your eyes. So I'm pleased to see that you have good internet connections. You can hear me and follow presentation well. That's great comfort. So let me start. I have a few minutes before we will have first break, just to get refreshed, and let's jump into Incoterms 2020. So going from Incoterms 2010 to Incoterms 2020, already 1 year of using them gives us some feedback and understanding of issues, and I would say most of the issues remain like before, because I would say luckily it's evolution, it's not revolution. So most of these conditions are same, but there were some updates and improvements. So this gives us kind of good comfort in using new publication. We need to get update, but on the other hand, we don't need to be scared. There's no reason whatsoever to use the new publication as soon as possible. So basically, when we negotiate contracts, of course, so we can and we should consider some model forms to possibly modify. ICC developed and updated recently this force majeure clause, hardship clause, and many people are questioning, asking, Paul, what do you think? ICC, what to do with this COVID-19 pandemic? Is it force majeure? Is it not? Is it hardship? Am I still responsible for escalating cost? Can I cancel the contract? So basically, that's exactly something which these clauses are above all a hardship clause possibly. So it can be, the impact can be force majeure depending on its scope. And of course, Incoterms, ICC publication. I hope you already have that book on your table. This is actually official ICC interpretation. So if you use the Incoterm and you say you specify the place to which that Incoterm is to be explained, and you say Incoterms 2020, you include couple of pages, okay, couple of pages into your contract. So you clarify these obligations, responsibilities between seller and the buyer. So they are to streamline negotiation of contracts. Of course, it is not kind of price indicator, but chosen Incoterm would have impact on the price, because more obligations, certainly price will increase. And of course, as I already said, some other aspects are very directly influenced by Incoterm, like obligatory inspection of goods. If it's requested by exporter's country, who is responsible for export clearance would be responsible for mandatory export inspection, for instance. We should think about exact time or period for delivery. And Incoterms say how goods are to be delivered. Sometimes they are delivered, but also beyond the place of delivery, seller contracts for the carriage. So he delivers and prepays for ongoing transport. So it's mainly about exact delivery place, which means transfer of risks in relation to delivery, transport of the goods. Who has the risk should consider insurance. In two cases, Incoterms actually say that somebody is responsible for insurance. Seller would be responsible under CIF and CIP to insure the goods for the transport, which is at the risk of the buyer. So basically, seller insures the goods in favor of the buyer. When there is possibly need, or it's a good idea to insure your risks for yourself, there is no obligation under Incoterms, but it is a good idea to really insure yourself against your risk you face. So only in CIF and CIP, Incoterms do say that seller is insuring goods in favor of the buyer. Logically, because the seller also contracts for the carriage at the risk of the buyer. So he will also insure the goods under these terms in favor of the buyer who has that risk. Clearance, important and covered by Incoterms. And of course, cost division, that's again in relation to deliver the goods, very clearly set in Incoterms. To some extent, but remember, very concisely, Incoterms suggest very briefly which document or documents seller is to provide to the buyer, but only to some extent in relation to delivery documents, and generally maybe for some other documents in relation to clearance. So you need to be more specific. You need to use seller and the buyer. You need to say more about documents and their issuers and contact. So it's the rule to be included in the contract. We call them trade terms. Now, we used to call them delivery terms, but now in ICC we call them trade terms, international trade terms, commercial terms, because they cover more than just delivery. They are international, but they are to be used as an international standard also for domestic transport. So it's not so common, but more and more in my country, I know more and more parties use Incoterms also for domestic deliveries. They are not obligatory. As far as I know, there is no country which legally requires for each contract of sale or so to use Incoterms. They are recommended, but more or less they are not obligatory, but more or less because of market use and customs and logistics and tax people and whatever, always kind of use Incoterms. So it's more or less requested by practice to use them. So they are used everywhere worldwide, with some exceptions, of course, not for delivery of services. I know in some markets, for instance, in deliveries of rice, as far as I've seen, standard contracts, they might not use Incoterms for some commodities or so, or modify them. So not obligatory, but heavily used for the right reasons, and of course to help us to set up the contracts and avoid disputes, having this clarified. First one was introduced in 1936. I'm sure you already know a couple of last revisions, and let's focus on the last one, which is in force, to be used, kind of applicable, implemented from the 1st January 2020. So now we are recommended to use it. On the other hand, you don't have to use it. I mean, you don't have to use Incoterms 2020. Sometimes people say, if I sign a contract and I say Incoterms, it automatically means Incoterms 2020. There would be strong assumption it's the last revision, but it depends on your previous dealing with the buyer and other conditions of the contract. So not necessarily if we say nothing, it would be Incoterms 2020. Most probably yes, but we should always be clear in our contract. We should say Incoterms 2020 or Incoterms 2010 if we have good reason to use, if we wish to use the previous book. As still some companies do. It takes time to swap for new publication, having new contracts and so on. A lot of contracts, of course, are on continuous basis. So it's time for first break. So please relax for 15 minutes and I can jump into the topic. So basically with Incoterms, the beauty is you choose one of these 11 abbreviations, like FCA. You specify the place as precisely as practical, but quite often we need to be quite specific, not saying just maybe a city, but exact address. And this place, the interpretation would be related to. This place might be delivery place. It might be destination place to which goods are to be shipped to, or it might be both. So be always careful which Incoterm you are talking about, but always very important to be precise, as suitable for the case. And then, good advice again, state which book, which Incoterm you are using, Incoterms 2020, or maybe still because of longer relationship which needs to be updated. Maybe with the new Incoterm 2020 in the future. So maybe we can use Incoterms 2010, and still many companies do. But really, if you still use Incoterms 2010, consider really enhancing your contracts, because the new publication is always updated, clear, and so on. And as you will see, there are not many changes, and arguably all the changes are certainly for very good. So I'm not actually concerned with any change, but some changes, of course, need to some interpretation and, I mean, understanding and being maybe a bit more careful to implement them. If you don't say Incoterm, if you say just FCA, it's open to interpretation. In some countries, of course, in my country, it would be still Incoterm, but there could be confusion which. In some countries, like in the US, they used to have their own terms, and their commercial law has, trade delivery terms, which, I mean, interpretation can differ. Under English law, again, FOB or CFR might have different meaning, slightly different meaning than FOB Incoterms 2020. So don't take it for granted. It's always ICC Incoterms publication. You might be surprised, so there could be misunderstandings, or it could be abused in case of dispute. The other party will claim something else. So always say which publication. Choose ICC Incoterms and say which one. And of course, it's good to have the publication. I would always recommend. You need to have the book. You need to sometimes look for detail. And sometimes, you need to make sure that your other party also knows and has it. So sometimes it's good to actually kind of copy. We agreed on FOB. Here you have the copy of the publication in relation to FOB. So, if you deal with a newcomer, not so experienced customer, so it's good to be really in detail discuss what the book says, and possibly clarifying, putting more precise information in our contract. Also remember, this is kind of inclusion of Incoterms. Incoterms become part of the contract, but some other parts of contract, and I've seen this many times, other specific conditions of the contract can override the general interpretation of Incoterms. So sometimes you have Incoterm quite well chosen, and then other conditions of the contract say something conflicting, different, problematic. But if it is specific condition of the contract, then you have a problem, yeah. And of course, in case of dispute, judge or arbiter would have to kind of make decision, and most likely, clear specific conditions. I mean, clear specific conditions generally override general conditions. So be careful that your contract conditions don't conflict, don't override, don't change intended Incoterm interpretation, unless this kind of modification was really well thought through and intended. So saying this in your contract, you specify all this, which is covered by 10 articles, seller's obligations, and 10 articles, buyer's obligations in relation to delivery, customs, documents, transport, delivery document, marking, packaging, cost distribution, division between seller and the buyer. And also, as I said, Article 10 is about kind of mutual assistance, notices, and other support assistance seller owes to the buyer and the other way around. Certainly, Incoterms don't cover everything. It's not contract on its own. Goods and other conditions like payment and so on need to be stated well in the contract. And of course, Incoterms say what the seller should do, what the buyer should do in relation to delivery. But if this is not done, with small exception like premature transfer of costs and risks, Incoterms don't say consequences of the breach. If the seller does not deliver the goods, seller breached his obligation, but what is his liability? What is a remedy buyer can seek from the seller and so on? So this, limitation of liability, damages, liquidated damages, all these conditions, contract should clearly say. So consequences of delays, breaches of contracts, contract conditions, Incoterms don't deal with these consequences. And already stated, transfer of property, ownership, title is not covered by Incoterms. Here I need to state one confusing issue. Sometimes people get confused about title because we know the document of title, bill of lading. Bill of lading is document of title. So you would say, if I give you bill of lading, I give you title to the goods. So I'm passing you what? I'm not passing you ownership to the goods. I'm passing you the right to dispose with the goods, possession of the goods, to take them, deal with them. But it does not mean you are on this own also owner, legally owner of these goods. They could be still owned depending on the contract or the law. Contract is subject to, it can be still owned, legally speaking, by the seller. So remember, Incoterms don't say when buyer becomes owner to the goods. In this context, title does not mean, let's say, disposal rights, but title in this context means property rights, ownership to the goods. So be a bit careful. Bill of lading is not about ownership of the goods, but about title to the goods, right to take them over, dispose with them, possess them, but not legally. It does not equal to kind of legal ownership rights in the goods. And already stated the effect of external risks. We cannot really mitigate sanctions, force majeure, withdraw licenses for export or import, new tariffs, prohibitions, and so on. This consequences of this, whether seller is still responsible for delivery or not, depends on other contract terms or maybe on the law. If this equals to force majeure law, applicable law covers, then maybe, but certainly Incoterms don't cover this. So think about really making sure your contract deals with this in clear manner, property rights in the goods and dispute resolution. Sometimes people think, Paul, Incoterms, this is ICC set of rules. If there is any dispute, ICC will decide who is right, who is wrong. Not really. This dispute in relation to Incoterm interpretation would be solved as any other dispute under the contract by the court or arbitration as chosen. Of course, they might look, certainly they would, if their attention is brought to this. They will look at they would have to look at the book, they would look at other guidances, they might ask ICC for expert opinion also. But basically, ICC, unless ICC arbitration court has been chosen, ICC as such is not solving, making decisions on disputes also. All right, but of course there is official interpretation on some issues. If so, requested from ICC also official publications, guidances, which certainly are taken as a resource in case of disputes of meaning of this or that. Incoterms are well structured, 10 articles, seller's obligations, and corresponding 10 articles covering buyer's obligations. And of course, before we jump into each Incoterm, I wish to state the importance of understanding these 4 main categories. X works, seller delivers in its own warehouse, placing goods at the disposal of the buyer, that's it. So the buyer would be responsible for everything, including, of course, transport of the goods from seller's warehouse. So delivery is in seller's warehouse. F terms, seller delivers under FCA in his own warehouse or in some other place. Basically, under F terms, seller delivers when he delivers goods to the carrier. Most often chosen, contracted for by the buyer. So seller delivers, most likely arranging some pre-carriage to the place where buyer's carrier takes over the goods. So basically delivery is when goods are delivered to the place where the main transport starts. Okay, similar to X works. C terms are like F terms. Basically, they are very, very similar. But the main difference is, again, seller delivers to the carrier, to the place where transport starts, like F terms. But the difference is here, seller actually contracts for the carriage and prepays for the carriage, for the transport. But again, delivery takes place when goods are handed over to the carrier in place where transport starts, the main carriage transport starts. So delivery is like in case of F terms. So these 3 groups can be put into one category, departure terms. Goods are delivered to the place where goods are departed, shipped from. Yeah, so when goods are shipped from, taken over by the carrier from the shipper, delivery takes place. D terms are very, very different because here, actually, seller only delivers when goods arrive to the destination. So destination is also delivery place. So delivery takes place when goods arrive to the destination. Destination equals delivery. So remember, shipping, departure terms, delivery at the place where goods come from, are shipped from. X works, F terms, C terms. D are real delivery terms. Delivery is in destination. So indeed, only when goods arrive, delivery takes place. All right, so that's the main difference, and certainly D terms and C terms are often misunderstood. So here on this slide, you have, just for your reference, you will have the reflection of this categorization, and the other 2 slides are again for your good reference, because in one slide I wanted to kind of cover the main obligations for the seller and the buyer in relation to main issues, main obligations, such as delivery, documentation, clearance, and so on. So no need to go through each and every sentence here, good for your reference. Overview. When it comes to deliveries, again, what we have said, maybe using another illustration. X works, delivery is at seller's warehouse or possibly in some other warehouse under control or hired by the seller, but it should be in seller's country. Otherwise, we really confuse obligations in relation to clearance. So seller's warehouse generally, and loading, export clearance, any other clearance, buyer is responsible for. As you see, F terms and all other terms are beyond customs clearance export border. So exporter is responsible for clearance. With FCA, if the delivery is related to seller's warehouse, seller loads the goods on incoming vehicle. If the delivery is under FCA, some other place, not seller's warehouse, seller delivers on a transport vehicle ready for unloading. So basically, seller sends the goods on truck most likely, and unloading, loading on other means of conveyance, transport, everything then is buyer's obligation. As you see with CPT or CIP, the delivery is like in case of FCA. So it depends. Place of delivery can be stated and could be, should be possibly stated in the contract. Basically, where a seller delivers to the first carrier, hands over goods to the first carrier, and then delivery takes place. Could be as early as in seller's warehouse. If the seller organizes, as allowed by the contract, shipment from his own warehouse by multimodal transport, then delivery can take place in seller's warehouse. Most probably it would be in some terminal or so, where the main carrier, the carrier for the main carriage, will take over the goods. Of course, it could be in land, but it could be also somewhere in the port. So FCA, CPT, CIP would be most likely container yard, terminal, where goods are to be taken over by the carrier, either arranged by the buyer under FCA or by the seller under C terms. FAS is to be used only for sea or water, underwater inland transport alongside ship. FOB, CFR, CIF, you see, delivery is in the same place, on board a vessel. So CIF, CFR, FOB, the same obligation when it comes to deliver the goods for the seller. Ship goods, load the goods on board the vessel in port when the shipment starts, shipment port, loading port. With C terms, of course, transport is prepaid. With CIF, also insurance like CIP. D terms are a bit confusing, but we already know. Under D terms, seller delivers only when goods arrive to the destination. And again, destination is delivery. It should be stated clearly in the contract. DAP means generally delivered on a means of conveyance, on a vessel, on a truck, on an airplane. So when goods are automatically kind of unloaded from means of conveyance, like in case of air transport, it is actually more sensible to use DPU, because DPU means unloaded by the seller at the risk and cost of the seller at the destination. When goods are in containers, container in this context is kind of meant to be part of transport, let's say facility. So DAP basically means in container ready for unloading by the buyer. DPU basically means unloaded from the container in terminal. So this should be really used when buyer wants goods in destination to be unloaded from the container. So basically, if you are, I don't know, in Hanoi, Vietnam, and goods go to Haiphong, port of discharge, and it would be full container load, you wish to kind of borrow that container and take goods from Haiphong to Hanoi, it would make sense to use DAP Haiphong. So they don't unload it in Haiphong. You will take the goods from there, you will take them to Hanoi, unload, and return the containers to Haiphong or so. Only if it's less than full container load, you wish goods to be unloaded from container, put in container freight station, and then you will put them on your own truck or so, then you would prefer DPU Haiphong. So remember, unloading from means of conveyance from container, a DPU obligation of the seller to arrange for this. And of course, DAP, DPU can be related to port of discharge or some other terminal, but they can also, you know, the delivery destination could be as far as buyer's warehouse. So again, we can have DAP buyer's warehouse or DPU buyer's warehouse, delivery there. Difference would be unloading by the seller, yes or no. DDP means seller would be also responsible for import clearance. So problematic, most likely for him. Should not really lightly choose it. But remember, DDP is like DAP plus import clearance. It's not unloaded. Yeah. So if you wish to have DDP and also unloaded, you would have to kind of modify DDP, say unloaded. Yeah, you would have to, if that's the case, because DDP does not include unloading at the destination by the seller. So having the last Incoterm publication, just quickly the main changes, the way how it is published. So traditional format, each Incoterm, but then once more Incoterms are published in a very practical manner. Basically, each article, 10 articles for the seller and the buyer, under each article, you have all these articles for each Incoterm. So you can say A1 under X works, A1 under FCA, and 1 CPT, and so on. So you nicely see the differences for each particular article for each Incoterm. More information, more guidance, reordering articles, new article for carriage and insurance. It was in one article, now it's separated. Delivery, transfer of risks are, you know, at the beginning. So there was ordering change. And also new article 9, which summarizes, enumerates costs. So in previous publications, you had to read each article and see what cost seller and buyer has. But now it's still there, but it's one more summarized in article 9. So here you see, you know, kind of summary of sellers and buyers costs. And there is new option for FCA to accommodate common need, and I will focus on this common need, you know, to have bill of lading, which kind of clashes with FCA. And the FCA will deliver goods to the carrier on incoming vehicle. So you are not responsible for loading on board the vessel. This is beyond. But quite often parties arrange for letter of credit, which requires a shipped on board bill of lading. So what to do, how to possibly help seller to get the bill of lading. So drafting group actually developed some kind of additional option parties can choose. Still problematic, but at least it helps a bit a seller to deal with such a situation. I will talk about that. And the main difference, I would say two main differences, changes. One is in CIP. In the past, CIF and CIP requested the same minimum insurance cover, equal to Institute Cargo Clauses C. Now for CIP, the default, the request, unless parties agree otherwise, is that seller insures goods, at least, I mean, covers them for all risks, Institute Cargo Clauses A. With CIF, there was no change. CIF is meant really for commodity trade when where the minimum insurance is usually suitable. So remember, CIP different, higher coverage, CIF no change. There is also a clarification. It was possible in the past as well, but now it's clearly stated that under FCA, buyer can use its own transport means. If the buyer owns vessels or trucks, he might ask seller to deliver goods to his people, drivers. He will take over. He will actually carry goods on its own. If that's the case, if this is the case, so the buyer does not necessarily need to contract with the independent carrier. Buyer can transport goods himself. And similarly, under D terms, seller might, if he has its own fleet of trucks or so, or airplanes, he can possibly transport the goods to the destination using its own means of conveyance. Again, if of course this is possible as per the rules and so on. Maybe there could be some limits in some countries when it comes to international transport, but generally under Incoterms, this is possible unless prohibited by the contract. DAT with Incoterms 2010 was not so popular, maybe a bit confusing. Delivered at terminal. There was confusion what the terminal means. Can this be also warehouse of the buyer, for instance? So now the drafting group actually clarified this, and it was renamed to be DPU. So everybody clearly understands delivered at place unloaded. So unloaded and delivery place could be any place, not only terminal, which was widely defined anyway, but now we don't really care. It can be any place, including buyer's warehouse, and unloaded at the risk and cost of the seller. So renaming and kind of interpreting for bigger, wider use. And some, just kind of clarification in relation to security-related issues regarding transport. So these are the main changes. A lot of discussions have been done about, maybe including X-Works loaded, common modification, maybe abolish, delete X-Works and DDP, which are complicated in relation to customs obligations of seller under DDP or buyer under X-Works for export-import clearance. FAS not being too much used, but this has not been really taken on board. A lot of good discussions, but they did not lead to changes. In a summary, you still have 11 terms. And the main differences indeed are DAT is DPU, renaming and kind of, explaining Place of delivery can be any place, preferably in buyer's country or somewhere on the way. In my my environment, quite often it's not buyer's country, not always, but maybe the terminal in the port of delivery. So does not need to be always buyer's warehouse or place in buyer's country, of course. And the other big change, and very practical, and I like it, is CIP insurance. Insurance now is requested to be of extensive coverage. No change with CIF, which might be a bit confusing. We wanted change with CIF as well, but it has been chosen just to cover. To change only CIP insurance. Remember that. So let's deal with each and every Incoterm. So Xworks, you already know, placed by the seller at disposal of the buyer in seller's warehouse or maybe some other warehouse in seller's country. Not cleared for export, not loaded by the seller. So buyers should be very careful. Can I clear the goods for export in foreign country, not being a resident? Can I do it? Can I do it through my customs broker, through my freight forwarder? From European Union, for instance, you cannot do that. In EU, only a resident company can clear goods for export from EU out. So this would not work for you guys buying from EU, and might be problem maybe for some other regions. It might be no problem maybe for ASEAN countries or so, for some customs unions, for obvious reasons. So this might be big trouble for the buyer. And secondly, loading. You need to arrange with your carrier also loading. And for instance, with convention we have in Europe, with some other adjacent countries, CMR contract for road transport does not include loading and unloading. So this would have to be, of course, specifically contracted, agreed by the carrier. That carrier will do the loading. Or as a buyer, I would have to find somebody else in the seller's country, to some external company, to load the goods. Or I should modify Xworks, saying seller will load the goods. And then, of course, if I really wish to have that, I should then say Xworks loaded. But that's not enough, because it does not say clearly who will have the cost and risk. So I should say Xworks loaded by the seller at the risk and cost of the seller or the buyer. I should really make it clear whether seller does not only do it, but also takes cost of it and the risk of it. Or I should go for FCA, which deals with this, as we will learn. So these are the main problematic features of the Xworks. So I can say these are the key issues. Quite often buyer does not really fully appreciate the demanding nature of the Incoterm for him. Export clearance. Sometimes buyer somehow arranges that clearance is done by the freight forwarder or carrier of the buyer, and seller somehow allows them to use their name, customs number or so. So it's done by the buyer, yes, but vis-a-vis customs authorities, it's done by the exporter. It's done by the buyer as an agent, if you wish, at the risk of the seller as an exporter. If the buyer or his carrier does it incorrectly or so, customs authorities will later go against the exporter because clearance was done using its number, its name. So they are, you know, the counterparty for the customs. So be very careful as an exporter if you allow buyer to clear the goods using your name, your number, because it would be done, basically clearance would be done practically by you. And of course, buyer can do some mistakes, or even maybe, you know, abuse and use different code or so to pay lower duties or so, and then you might be in a big trouble, a lot of penalties after years. So this risk for the seller would be high. Another big issue might be, of course, loading by the buyer, problematic, and seller might not know where goods go to. They might not go to the buyer's country. He might not know which transport will be used. So basically, the buyer should inform where goods go to, how they are to be packed, so they would be sufficiently packed. As you will know, I'm sure if goods are broken, damaged due to insufficient packaging, this will excuse carrier from his liabilities. Also, cargo insurance company will not pay or pay less because they would have the counterclaim. So packaging, sufficiency of packaging is a big, important issue. There have been reports in my country as well, still more in the past, that there were actually frauds. Somehow somebody knew from the seller or the buyer, somebody else, fraudster, knew that a carrier from buyer should come to pick up the goods. So basically they sent a truck pretending they are the guys, they are the carrier to collect goods on behalf of the buyer, and they have actually stolen. They stole the goods from the exporter, so the goods were taken not by the right carrier, but by some fraudsters. And then there was big dispute between seller, who is responsible, and the buyer, whose mistake it was. Must seller deliver new goods, or buyer was in that loss or so. So, you know, they need to make sure, seller should make sure that he knows exactly which carrier, which car, maybe even copy of the passport, whatever you will know, to double check the right person, driver, whatever, make calls, verify that the carrier is indeed the right one. Again, importance of specifying exact point of delivery. Factory of the exporter can be huge. So buyer's carrier needs to know where to go exactly. So it's quite common to state the GPS location in contracts also, so the driver knows exactly where to go to pick up the goods from the seller. And the big issue is also transport document, which should kind of, if requested by letter of credit, for instance, which should kind of evidence that seller delivered the goods in time in his own warehouse. So I shall in a minute talk about that. And in my country also, exporters sometimes had big problem to actually prove vis-a-vis taxman that it was export. It left European Union. Just because buyer is from India or Philippines does not mean it will go from Czech Republic to Philippines. The Filipino company can sell it in Poland, for instance. Yeah, as we know, we have really global global business these days. So exporter should ask the buyer in the contract to give him some copy of transport documents or so. Exporter in my country would need to reclaim VAT. On export, we don't charge VAT, but of course we can also deduct the VAT we paid on inputs, on purchases, but we need to prove it was sent out of European Union. So, you know, issues with this might be encountered. And of course, importance of specification of time of delivery. So quite often they agree that maybe delivery would be in the second part of October, but buyer should inform 1 week earlier on exact date. Yeah, so seller knows exactly when to put the goods on the place. And if the buyer's carrier comes late, already the risk and cost will be with the buyer. Yeah, but of course, even if there are delays in taking goods by the buyer's carrier, seller, the risk and cost would be with the buyer already, but seller must take care of the goods, kind of you know, secure them, insure them. So seller is still responsible to keep the goods at the disposal of the buyer, protecting them from bad weather and so on. So, you know, you still have some obligations, even if goods were taken late and not taken in time by the buyer. When it comes to documents, Incoterms only requires seller to give the buyer commercial invoice, nothing else. So the other documents, packing lists, other types of invoices such as customs invoices, also not really under Ex Works, but maybe some cooperation needed. This needs to be fixed by the contract. Certificate of origin, inspection, all that is to be really fixed by the contract. What document might be required as evidence of delivery? Here, Incoterms say seller has no obligation to give any document to the buyer. Buyer, on the other hand, should give sufficient evidence of taking the goods from the buyer. So maybe some receipt document. So basically, especially when letter of credit is in place, seller and the buyer, they should figure out a document seller should present under letter of credit. Seller would prefer a document he or she will issue, like delivery list or packing list issued by me saying goods are there. Buyer might be hesitant and saying, yeah, maybe you will say that, and the reality would be different. So buyer might suggest that letter of credit requires a document signed by the buyer or both. But then seller should be very careful, because buyer might not come over, not sign a document, and seller would not be able to present such document under letter of credit. So very vulnerable, because the condition is controlled by the buyer. Quite often with Ex Works, letter of credit requires transport document. Again, there is a risk for the seller that the buyer will not contract for the carriage. Carrier does not come. Carrier comes late. Goods will be broken, damaged when loaded by the buyer's carrier. So basically, seller needs transport document, but seller does not control the carrier. He does not control the issuance of transport document. So this might be risk, high, difficult to digest. Sometimes parties agree that delivery would be in some other warehouse. So again, then seller contracts for the warehousing, and then seller can control the issuance of warehouse receipt. Goods will be placed at the name of the buyer to pick up the goods. Not so common, but this might be possible. I've seen also situations when really parties, they really wanted Ex Works, buyer wanted Ex Works, but the cost was high for the goods. Seller was worried about having documents controlled by the buyer. So they actually agreed that the seller will invite inspection company to verify that goods were indeed placed at the disposal of the buyer in the right quantity, quality, and so on. So LC requested actually invoice, delivery list of the exporter, and inspection certificate issued by independent inspector confirming goods were placed in good order and time at the name of the buyer. So remember, generally speaking, if you are a seller and you have letter of credit, you would like to control the documents LC requires. If they are controlled by the buyer because he signs them, issues them, or he controls the issuers like carriers, a unique document from, you are vulnerable, you have the risk, this will not happen. So that's Xworks. FCA, two options. Seller and buyer agree on FCA seller's warehouse. Seller clears goods for export, and also with FCA seller's warehouse, he is responsible for loading the goods on incoming vehicle, which is a really good idea. So instead of Xworks loaded with this confusion, why parties don't use FCA seller's warehouse? That's good in this situation when we need a loading in seller's warehouse. If the delivery is in some other place, seller delivers goods on a means of transport, like most likely truck or maybe train, yeah, a vessel or so. And unloading and further loading, shipping, all is at the risk and cost of the buyer. Basically, key issues. Buyer is responsible for the main carriage, so suitable when delivery is to take place to the carrier, like in terminals or so. Buyer is responsible not only for import clearance, but also for any clearance in transit. Should not be a problem because he arranges most likely for the carriage anyway. And of course, as suitable and practical, we should specify the place of delivery, not just FCA Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, but you know, so street number 5 or so, exact place of that delivery or terminal. So time of delivery, most likely buyer would like to have some flexibility to specify the time of delivery in a precise manner later when he arranges for the carriage. Which document, for instance, letter of credit is to require? Again, most likely transport document or freight forwarder's document, if so agreed. But seller should be careful. If the transport is organized by the buyer, I need transport document from the buyer's carrier. I need buyer to tell the carrier to give me transport document. What if the buyer does not contract for the carriage? What if the carrier comes late? What if the carrier does not want to give me transport document? Or it would be unclean or whatsoever. I have problem. I don't control that delivery transport document. Buyer does. What could be the remedy? Remember, even under FCA, parties can agree that actually seller will contract for the carriage. Seller can contract for the carriage at the risk and cost of the buyer, but this would have to be clearly stated in the contract of sale. So this might be a solution for the seller, saying, yeah, I will contract for the carriage with your carrier, Mr. Buyer, but I will control the logistics. I will, have contractual relationship with the carrier. So I will be able to get that transport document in time. So this choice is there. Again, a seller needs, to have that copy of transport document or so to claim VAT, to prove it was export for tax reasons or so. All right, so that's important in the place of delivery, time of delivery. If the carriage is organized by the buyer, which is the default situation. There needs to be cooperation between buyers and sellers, freight forwarders, especially when delivery is not seller's warehouse. Seller would have to do some pre-carriage. So basically, I need my freight forwarder, my carrier, to deliver the goods to the freight forwarder carrier of the buyer at the right place and time. So a bit challenging. Documents, of course, again, need to fix documentation. When it comes to delivery document, can be possibly freight forwarder's certificate, but this needs to be really agreed. If there is letter of credit, we know banks don't accept freight forwarder's certificate unless specifically allowed for. Most likely, a requested document under letter of credit would be some transport document. In Europe and countries around, we have the CMR convention. So this is common document, can be a railway bill or, airway bill. So these types of documents are multimodal transport documents. But remember, as a seller, if you don't contract for the carriage, you have the risk that buyer will not do it, or you will not be able to get the transport document in time, clean one, and so on. You need to deliver the goods in time to the carrier. Most likely there will be some pre-carriage, and then most likely you would need document you might not control, as you know. Now let's go into interesting topic already highlighted, new option in Incoterms for FCA. As the case is, often letter of credit requires under FCA delivery place is port. Generally speaking, you would expect FCA some kind of cargo receipt. Seller needs to deliver goods just to the carrier, ready for unloading from transport document. So he's not responsible for unloading, loading on a ship or so. So basically, the right document would be some kind of cargo receipt issued by the carrier when a truck sent by the seller comes to the terminal of the carrier. But most certainly, if the letter of credit is in place, transport states port of loading, letter of credit states port of loading, and port of discharge like Hamburg, port of loading. Whatever Incoterm you have, even if you have X-Works Hamburg, it does not really matter. Yeah? But basically, if the letter of credit states that shipment starts from the port of loading and it requires bill of lading, basically this document, this bill of lading needs to be shipped on board. You would think under Incoterm, FCA should be a receipt for shipment only, because the loading is not seller's obligation, but buyer's. It is beyond delivery to the carrier. But if the letter of credit is in place, so remember UCP, in case transport starts with port, always requires, whatever Incoterm you have, else requires shipped on board bill of lading. So now seller is in a trouble. How can I get bill of lading? I just deliver goods to the carrier in Hamburg. I get some cargo receipt, but letter of credit requires me to present bill of lading, which shows goods were loaded on board on 10 October or earlier. So basically, I need bill of lading from the buyer. And what if the buyer does not give me this bill of lading? And the bill of lading actually shows that goods were loaded after I delivered. This is buyer's obligation. Why letter of credit wants me to present document which evidences buyer's obligation was proven, was done, yeah? So this is problematic, but if this is the case, And we see many LCs having FCA and bill of lading and so on. I need shipped on board bill of lading. Drafting group for Incoterms 2020 said, okay, we understand this is very problematic, so we should be very careful to accept such a condition, but at least we can help him a bit. There is big problem, there is potential big problem for the seller beneficiary. If the buyer does not give that bill of lading with all these conditions fulfilled, seller might not be paid. Anyway, the somehow kind of mitigation of that big problem is that this option can be chosen. So if the parties actually agree on this, FCA and bill of lading to be presented by the seller, in that case, the buyer has obligation under Incoterms to instruct the carrier to issue bill of lading to the seller at the risk and cost of the buyer. Bill of lading would be issued at the risk and cost of the buyer. The bill of lading will be given by the carrier to the seller, and the seller now can present the bill of lading to the buyer under letter of credit and get paid. So at least here, seller has some kind of tool to push the buyer, give me bill of lading. You have to instruct carrier under Incoterms to give me bill of lading. But still, of course, seller has big risk that the buyer will not do it, his carrier will not do it, or shipment will be late, document would be unclean. Basically, something happens after seller fulfilled his FCA obligation to deliver the goods to the carrier nominated by the buyer. So remember, this option does not eliminate the risk, the problem, the issues, only slightly helps the seller to really have some kind of tool to require the bill of lading under Incoterms from the buyer. But otherwise, the risk is still there if the payment is to be done against shipped on board bill of lading in connection with FCA. So remember, CPT is like FCA, I would say, yeah. But here the difference is I deliver again goods to the carrier, and it could be even a delivery could be even in a seller's warehouse. Contract should actually specify the delivery place, but Incoterms, as you see, CPT is related to the destination. So destination is place to which seller must contract for the carriage to. But the delivery takes place when goods are delivered to the carrier, with which contract for carriage is arranged and prepaid by the seller. Yeah. So delivery should be stated somewhere else in the contract. If it is not, delivery is where goods are taken over by the carrier for the main carriage. So for instance, you are based in, let's say in Hanoi, you ship goods from Vietnam to Czech Republic. If you organize, if a contract says nothing, CPT Prague, Czech Republic. If the contract says nothing about delivery place, and you organize shipment from your warehouse in Hanoi, delivery would be in a warehouse Hanoi. Most likely you will organize air transport, Hanoi, Prague airport. So then delivery is terminal in Hanoi nearby airport. If goods go by sea, then let's say CPT Hamburg, goods go from Haiphong. The delivery would be terminal in Haiphong when goods are handed over to the carrier. Okay, and again, then we should think about transport document. Should this be shipped on board bill of lading? Then we have similar issues like FCA. Yeah? But here it makes sense because seller contracts for the carriage, so he might be in a good position to get, of course, shipped on board bill of lading and the CPT. Unless CFR maybe more suitable for sea transport would have been chosen. So the main problem, of course, is you have two critical points. One is where a seller contracts for the carriage and pays for the carriage to destination. And the first critical point, of course, is delivery, where goods are handed over to the carrier. If it is not fixed in the contract, it's basically up to the seller and his carrier responsible for the main carriage to where would be the place goods are handed over to the carrier. Sea terms, there is actually, I think there is problem. Maybe this is important for carriers and companies, not much for banks. But a bit problematically, Incoterms say that transit clearance under sea terms is responsibility of the buyer. But if the transport is organized by the seller, usually the carrier also does this transit clearance and so on. So it is logical, and in practice, this is done by the seller with his carrier. So, and under the contract of carriage. So it kind of practice somehow clashes with what Incoterms have as a default when it comes to transit clearance. I already highlighted the kind of importance to think about delivery place and destination place, especially with, with destination as well. You know, if you say CPT Prague or CPT Prague terminal in Žižkov, you know, if we don't specify, it will be up to the seller and his carrier to choose the place of delivery. So it's preferable if the contract states that in the Incoterm precisely. Seller contracts for the carriage and pays for it, but the risk of transport is with the buyer. Buyer should consider insurance. So buyer might need, of course, timely information about shipment, so he can or she can arrange for the cargo insurance. What about unloading? Of course, unloading is a risk of the buyer, as the whole transport is, but what about cost? What about cost? Unless it was paid under the contract of carriage by the seller, sometimes it's part of the freight, this air transport or so, or sea transport, often. So usually it's paid by the seller under the contract of carriage. If not, of course, unloading cost would be for the buyer to pay. Sea terms are very friendly with letters of credit, because letter of credit requires transport document, and seller will get transport document because he contracts for the carriage at the risk of the buyer, but at the cost of the seller. If there is a problem with the goods, if goods come late, this is problem for the buyer. If goods are damaged, this is problem for the buyer, because delivery was when goods were shipped from. If they come late, this is already a risk of the buyer. Buyer, despite the fact buyer did not contract for the carriage, under transport documents, under these international conventions, buyer as a consignee will get, based on that transport document, will get actually direct contractual rights to claim damages, claims, you know, from the carrier. So he should certainly, when goods arrive, make check, make reservations if goods are, or packaging is evidently in defective condition or so, and within the time frame, you know, to raise the claims, not to lose the right to you know, get compensation from the carrier. And this is also needed even if the goods are insured. Insurance company wants us to raise these claims in time, so the insurance company can then as assignee claim against the carrier. Carrier generally is responsible for delivery in a timely manner without damages and so on. Of course, his liabilities are limited in terms of money and scope based on the international conventions. Seller, of course, I've heard about case when, for instance, seller actually shipped the goods and forgot to inform the buyer about shipment. Goods came to the destination. Buyer did not know. Buyer was late to receive the goods. There was escalating cost, demurrages and so on. Generally, buyer would be responsible, but here, because seller did not inform the buyer in time, he was in breach of his notice obligations. So in that case, of course, seller was in a trouble. He did not fulfill his notifying obligation. So seller needs to inform a buyer in a right manner, so buyer can arrange for taking over the goods in destination, for instance. Which documents? Generally, Incoterms would require transport document. It depends on the transport. We should be a bit more careful with bill of lading because generally, of course, LC, of course, as well would require shipped on board. So here, seller needs to make sure he would have shipped on board bill of lading. He contracts for the carriage, so shipped on board bill of lading should not be big trouble for him to receive. Of course, he needs to make sure that he is able to deliver the goods to the carrier in time. So the pre-carriage and so on needs to be done well in advance. Contract for the carriage is done by the seller. At the risk of the buyer, buyer can claim, as we know from the carrier, having the transport document. He will receive from the carrier on delivery or original under letter of credit also. So no problem for the buyer to raise claims against the carrier, despite the fact arrangement of contract was done by the seller. I shall have some break, but I think I should run now to finish the first part. So let's jump into CIP. And CIP is like CPT. The same issues, the same problems. I don't really need to spend too much time on this, except I need to highlight once more that now with CIP, seller needs to arrange for extensive insurance cover, in layman terms called all risk coverage. Precisely, we should call for institute cargo clauses A or equivalent. Yeah, so it should be in the same coverage. This does not include automatically, of course, war risks and strikes, commotion risks, and so on. So if the buyer wants these risks to be covered as well, of course, buyer should fix it in the contract, require seller to arrange for this additional insurance as well. Especially strikes clauses, which cover terrorism risk and so on, it might be very suitable, as we all appreciate higher risks in many places of the world in relation to delays and strikes and so on. So that's the only that's something I should really highlight. And when it comes to documents, of course, especially when a letter of credit is required. What insurance document, insurance policy or certificate, what coverage, is 110% of CIP value enough, or we need higher because it's tailor-made goods, whose loss would be bigger trouble for the buyer. Are there any franchise deductibles to be limited? And also remember, seller should insure the goods up to the place of destination. But most likely the destination is not the final destination. There will be some ongoing carriage to the buyer's warehouse. So if we have CPT Haiphong, goods might go to Hanoi or somewhere else. This local transport might not be covered by insurance, seller organizes, unless we ask him. So either this would not be insured, or buyer will insure, division of insurance, all these issues. So maybe we can ask a seller to really insure goods for the whole journey from warehouse to warehouse. Good idea to consider. Otherwise, nothing to add in respect of CIP vis-a-vis CPT. Now, DAP. DAP means deliver to the destination. Delivery and destination, same place. Ready for unloading. So basically the container will be open or so buyer can pick up the goods and unload them at the destination. So seller has big risk of that transport, and especially delays, especially with sea transport, the risk of delays is high. So usually sellers are not eager to go for DAP with sea transport, because sea carrier, of course, his liability for delays is very, very limited, especially with sea transport. So you as a seller, you will only deliver when goods are delivered to the destination, ready for the buyer to unload them, pick them up. Here, the issue is, who has the risk? Who contracted for the carriage? Seller. Who has the risk of the transport? Seller. If goods are delayed or broken or whatever, who can claim against the carriage? Seller. But he needs buyer to raise the claims, the reservations at the destination against the carrier, because seller will not be there, buyer will be there. Buyer will know goods are evidently broken, or they came too late, or whatever. So basically, it is recommendable for the seller and the buyer to kind of think about this, and actually, seller should require the buyer to raise these claims vis-a-vis carrier as required by international conventions for that transport. So the seller can possibly then, enforce or sue the carrier for damages if this was indeed carrier's liabilities. Unloading cost. Sometimes goods are unloaded automatically, like air transport. Unloading is risk of the buyer in this case. But if it was already prepaid under the contract of carriage, then of course seller paid and cannot claim that cost from the buyer. If it was not prepaid, buyer will pay. With D terms, remember, there is actually a problem, especially with letters of credit, because you would expect letter of credit to be payable against document which evidences, which proves that seller delivered. He fulfilled his Incoterm obligation. But here, what document actually evidences goods were delivered to the destination on a truck or on the airplane ready for unloading. It would have to be some kind of cargo receipt or warehouse receipt issued in place of destination. Very cumbersome for the buyer for the seller to get. So LCs usually don't ask for such documents for obvious practical reasons. So usually a letter of credit requires transport document, but transport document only evidences shipment was in time. Goods were shipped from port of loading in time. It does not evidence, bill of lading does not evidence goods were delivered to the port of discharge in time. So this is a risk for the buyer. Yeah. So buyer should understand if the LC requires transport document and we have D term, this transport document does not prove seller fulfilled his obligations. Transport documents match F terms or C terms, but not E terms. So what can happen? Seller can ship the goods, he will be paid under letter of credit, goods don't arrive, but seller was paid. Of course, he should deliver new goods, pay damages for a late delivery, but buyer has actually a risk that seller might not do it. Also, there is actually an issue, possible issue with import clearance. Quite often, imagine you have DAP, goods should go to, let's say, Ulaanbaatar, DAP, Ulaanbaatar. If the, I don't know now, sorry for my ignorance, but if the import clearance is to be done at the border, let's say between Mongolia and China, somewhere at the border, then seller should deliver goods to the Ulaanbaatar, but import clearance to be done by the buyer should be done at the customs border between China and Mongolia. Buyer is responsible for the import clearance. If he does not do that, transport will be stuck. Truck driver would be delayed over there, and of course there will be big trouble, cost escalating, and so on. So there is importance for cooperation. Buyer should make sure that he is able to get all the documents and so on ready. So import clearance will be done. Basically, the carrier and the buyer's customs broker, freight forwarder needs to cooperate. So import clearance is done in time, and there is no extra delays, stoppage in customs border. This can be finally a problem for the seller, because if the importer does not do the import clearance, seller under the contract of carriage would be responsible for all the cost, because carrier would go against him. And then seller might be in a trouble to enforce payment of these costs and so on from the buyer. He might actually, not take up the goods later or whatever, and there could be full breach. So just kind of awareness, if you are seller and you are to deliver goods beyond the customs border for import clearance, there's extra risk and need for cooperation. It would be better for the seller, Chinese exporter, let's say, to agree on DAP, China-Mongolia border, customs border, from this point of view, from this issue point of view. Already I stated enough about documents. The documents, transport documents, do not really evidence delivery to the destination, only shipment to the destination. So that might be the problem. That might be the problem. More often we see under DAP in letters of credit request for insurance document. And people are kind of wondering, who has the risk? Seller. So he should get insured for himself. Why else he requires insurance document? It might be just kind of evidence that seller insured himself, or sometimes insurance document is actually issued or transferred in favor of the buyer. And again, if such an arrangement is done with the insurance company, basically you can kind of understand that buyer might have the risk. Because imagine seller ships, goods are damaged, seller is paid, he does not care. So who has the loss? Buyer. And buyer might be already owner of the goods if this was also the arrangement. So it makes sense if so arranged with insurance company that actually buyer would be insured party in such a situation. A bit unusual, a bit strange, but becoming more common. DPU is like DAP plus unloading, cost and risk for the seller. The same issues when it comes to how to prove delivery took place, unless really letter of credit required, cargo receipt, warehouse receipt also issued in place of destination, in place of delivery. Transport document only shows goods were shipped in time, yes, but not delivered to the destination in time. Otherwise, the same issues like the AP. The only extra issue is unloading. If the destination is terminal, it would be no big problem for the buyer, for the seller to arrange with the carrier unloading automatically from trucks or from vessels, from airplanes. This can be done in terminals, will be done. But if the destination is the buyer's warehouse, extra arrangement needs to be done with the carrier or somebody else to unload the goods, especially when they are heavy. Yeah? Then a driver might not be the guy to do that. So maybe some other arrangements will need to be done. The same issues, the same need to require buyer to raise claims against carrier to keep the rights of the seller, shipper, contracting party for the carriage vis-a-vis carrier. All right, so the same issues. And the last one before break, before I finish the first part of 7 Incoterms, we will have a break and then I will finish the C the delivery terms, and we will have the promised debate questions and answer session. So DDP, my dear friends, is like DAP. The same thing, the same thing. The only difference is now the seller is responsible for import clearance, which might be a problem. How can I clear the goods as a Czech guy in Kazakhstan or in Mongolia or in the Philippines? Might be possible, but maybe more problematic, facing the the bureaucracy and so on in foreign country, or it might be prohibited by customs code altogether. Sometimes again the same issue. Sometimes buyer allows seller to do the import clearance using his name and code and so on. So again, buyer should really think about that twice. If the import clearance is done by the seller at the name of the buyer, that's the buyer who would be facing later on some problems. I mean, penalties, inquiries, if not everything was done as it should also. So it can backfire big way. Unloading cost, like the AP, if not paid under the contract of carriage, buyer will pay. So it depends on the contract of carriage. And of course, this can be also fixed in the contract of sale, saying, yeah, Mr. Seller, you have to contract for it. So this question can be also addressed in contract of sale. Otherwise, the same thing, like the AP. So we have covered the Incoterms for any mode of transport or multimodal transport, very suitable for containerized shipments. Can be used for sea transport as well, but then you might have this kind of issue. Do we really need shipped on board below lading? Because that's not something which clearly comes from the Incoterms. But especially when letter of credit is involved and transport starts with sea transport, in port of loading, always shipped on board bill of lading or shipped on board multimodal bill of lading would be required under UCP by the bankers. Remember that. Anyway, time for another 15 minutes break. So I guess it's close to 10 minutes to 5. So 5 hours, 5 minutes, Taiwan time zone. I hope I'm not mistaken. So basically in 15 minutes, my dear colleagues, come back to your screens and start using chat or question and Q&A tool so we can look at your questions. So please enjoy another break. I hope you are full of energy for the last session. And I still owe you to cover the last 4 terms which are designed for sea transport or any other inland waterway transport. So I hope I am sharing the screen now. At least my Zoom informs me that you are supposed to see it now. So let's jump into the last 4 delivery terms. Free alongside ship is indeed designed for commodity trade. Not much use. There was serious discussion about dropping this term from Incoterms. But on the other hand, for commodity trade, when goods are to be indeed placed alongside the ship to be loaded by the buyer, or buyer making arrangement with port authorities or with the carrier, or most likely chartering the vessel and including the loading and unloading, then of course this term is suitable. I also seen this term being used for deliveries of commodities such as not only kind of timber and so on, but also or coal, etc., but also for oil when it is delivered in reservoirs ready for buyer to arrange pumping the oil into the tankers. Or surprisingly to me, I've also heard about one car producer based in Slovakia. I did training a few months ago, and they told me sometimes they use this FAS for deliveries of cars which are indeed not delivered to the carrier, but they are delivered in some parking location alongside the vessels. So the buyer arranges for cars to be drive into the vessel and taken over from that. So can be possibly used for deliveries like this. When we don't deliver to the carrier, then we would use FCA, but we will deliver next to the vessel for sea or inland waterway transport. Of course, it very much depends on commodity and the port of loading facilities and vessel facilities. So certainly, alongside a vessel might mean on a key in the port. So the vessel would get into the port. It would have to be kind of deep water port of loading, so the vessel can get there, and loading would be done most likely using facilities, cranes or so in the port of loading. Of course, loading and transport is arranged and paid, unless otherwise agreed, of course. I mean, arranged by the buyer, and of course, cost and risk for the buyer. But certainly they can possibly agree the seller will arrange the cost and the risk, the loading, and even contract for carriage. Seller in favor of the buyer at the risk and cost of the buyer. But generally, of course, buyer will do that. So one option is vessel can get into that port. If not, of course, they need to really think about other arrangements. Then the exporter would have to deliver goods on a smaller feeder vessel. Vessel will be in the high sea in the area of port of loading. So goods will be delivered on a smaller vessel next to the bigger vessel, and loading will be done by using facilities of that ocean chartered vessel. So a bit more difficult arrangement for both parties. So they certainly need to know what are the conditions in port of loading, and arranging the buyer the right vessel, and also buyer kind of fixing how the loading would be done, how goods are to be delivered by the seller alongside the vessel. Not much used in my country except the delivery of the cars, which I highlighted. I've heard about, otherwise I don't really see it much. And of course, the issue is specification of precise delivery point in port of loading, depending on port facilities. Transfer of risk will be when goods are delivered there. If the vessel comes late or so, this would be already a risk and cost of the buyer. They should consider what document seller should provide. Arguably, it should be some cargo receipt or wharfingers receipt, warehouse receipt, document evidencing goods are ready next to the vessel, ready in that port location. Asking for shipped on board bill of lading would be, again, going beyond that seller's delivery obligation. Sometimes I've heard there might be some, I mean, seller needs to think about possible requirements in relation to clearance. Usually the port would be kind of custom zone, so there should be no problem. But sometimes he might need to arrange for some transit clearance to get the goods to the quay in port of loading. And of course, need for close cooperation between seller and the buyer in relation to deliveries, loading, and so on. So buyer would be obliged to inform in advance about precise time of delivery, if so agreed, and seller to deliver goods there. Buyer would have the risk that his arranged vessel comes late, or there would be bad weather, not allowing loading in time, whatever. This is all buyer's risk and cost. Basically, for us bankers, from the letter of credit point of view, we see kind of difficulties to find the right document which would indeed evidence such a delivery. It's not really bill of lading as such, but maybe cargo receipt, warehouse receipts, especially if such document is document of title, which might be the case, then it would be kind of very difficult to get this document presented under LC, and then buyer having the document to pick up the goods and load them. This would not be practical at all. So it should not be document of title, maybe some inspection document or so, kind of evidencing delivery took place in time. Big risk if the LC requires shipped on board bill of lading for the seller, for the beneficiary of letter of credit. More common, of course, is FOB, very well known. One of the first terms we had, so still heavily used, even when ICC is very much recommending parties to use FCA for containerized shipments. But obviously, when letter of credit is in place, when seller needs shipped on board bill of lading, FOB is very much reflecting this shipped on board. FOB is shipped on board, not FCA. So I would, and I understand the preference for FOBs for sea transport from that angle, because it really matches data's requirements closer. Certainly, a seller should understand the risk he has, especially for containerized shipments. Seller delivers goods to the carrier in some terminal, to the carrier or agent of the carrier nominated by the buyer. So you deliver goods to the terminal, you get some cargo receipt. You don't control what is happening afterwards, but this is still at your risk and cost. So this handling in terminal, loading, which is under the contract of carriage done by the buyer usually, this is at your risk and cost. I recall once, I think it was 2006, I was doing seminar on Incoterms in Bangladesh. I think I was in Chittagong, and I've heard a lot of people crying. At that time, there were big floods. And a lot of these Bangladeshi exporters, of course, they had, like always, LCs asking for shipped on board bill of lading, FOBs. And they had big trouble. They delivered goods to the carrier, nominated by the buyer, or, you know, buyer's carrier or agent of that carrier or freight or whatever. So they followed the instructions from the buyer. They delivered the goods. And they did not have any control later, but there were floods, containers were flooded, not loaded, obviously, because damaged. They did not have the bill of lading, they could not get money under LCs, and they were screaming, hey, I delivered to the carrier nominated by the buyer, so I should be paid. I did what I could. Later, it was not under my control. Buyer should be responsible. Well, under FOB, you have that risk, that inherent essential risk is yours. Under FCA, risk would be already with the buyer. But of course, as we already know, if the LC requested under FCA as it would, bill of lading, despite the fact you would deliver the goods under FCA, you would not get paid under letter of credit. So you would have to claim the payment outside letter of credit, and arguably you should be paid by the buyer, but outside letter of credit, and certainly significant risk. This will not happen. So remember, FOB, seller, you have risk till goods are loaded on board the vessel in port of loading. Usually this is controlled by the buyer, as we know, he contracts for the carriage. But again, it can be arranged. Incoterms clearly say parties can agree that the loading contract for carriage can be arranged by the seller at the risk and cost of the buyer. So then certainly he controls the issuance of the bill of lading and the kind of logistics a bit closer. So that's something I would, as a beneficiary, especially when LC covers higher amount of monies, I would consider having FOB with this option, me, to contract for the carriage. Or I would just prefer CFR when I contract for the carriage, as requested by Incoterms as a default rule. So, you know, as a beneficiary, you always wish to control the documents LC requires. Basically, risk passes when goods are loaded on board the vessel in port of loading. Default rule, the default interpretation under Incoterms is goods are loaded when they firstly touch board of the vessel. So any other movement of these goods, trimming, lashing, and so on, this is already buyer's risk and cost. Yeah, so goods land on the board of the vessel and risk passes. Of course, if goods fall and they are damaged, they fall on the board, this would be still a risk of the seller. So loading must result in you know, correct loading, not damaged goods. So basically, goods are loaded, not falling and breaking down when being loaded. But when loaded, a risk pass. Of course, it depends on the customs in the port. So I think in Antwerp, it's well known that on board actually means when the goods are kind of fixed under the tackle of the vessel. So they are already kind of meant to be loaded, despite the fact physically they are not yet on that vessel. All right, so there could be custom in that port, which would define what shipped on board means in that particular port. Bill of lading, of course, it would be bill of lading, which document which evidences this, unless they agree, and I haven't seen it, kind of maid's receipt or so, but nobody really wants such a document. So it will be always shipped on board bill of lading, and we already highlighted possible risks for the seller to get such a document in time, unless he contracts for the carriage, as specifically agreed in the contract. My Bangladeshi friends in the past, I think the biggest problem they had, of course, they were not paid, cargo were damaged at their risk. The main problem that many of them had, they were not insured. So I would always highlight, Mr. Seller, you have the risk till goods are loaded on board the vessel. You have that domestic per carriage risk. Consider insurance for that transport. A lot of companies, including companies in my country, they don't see this transport risk significant, or basically don't get insurance, and then they would fully suffer consequences. So we highlighted the risks for the beneficiary under FOB having letter of credit. So having example, FOB Hamburg, goods go from Hamburg to Vietnam, and of course LC requires bill of lading. The UCP, we don't need to say shipped on board. The UCP Article 20 requires shipped on board bill of lading if transport starts with port. So basically, whatever Incoterms is, but of course in line with FOB, beneficiary needs to present shipped on board bill of lading. So he needs to make sure he will get that bill of lading. I highlighted the risks when he does not control the contract of a carriage. There is also another issue sometimes I have faced on my customers, and just highlight what happened. LC requested FOB, and LC requested, which is very common, In line with Incoterm, you would say, yeah, not exactly. It's not kind of mandatory, but LCs quite often require freight collect, bill of lading, freight collect, because cost is to be paid by the buyer. Incoterms don't say when buyer is to pay the freight. Freight should be paid by the buyer, but does not mean necessary he must pay the freight at the port of discharge. But generally, LCs require freight collect under FOB. And what can happen? Usually, buyer contracts for the carriage, but sometimes seller contracts for the carriage. I don't know exactly who contracted for the carriage. It does not really matter. But basically, sometimes carriers, for some destinations, they might be hesitant to actually contract for the carriage on basis of freight collect. Carrier might say, yeah, I have very bad experience, shipping goods to this country. Buyers delay taking goods. Sometimes they don't come up at all. I have problems to collect fees, my freight from the buyers, from the consignees. So sometimes carriers say, for these destinations, basically freight must be paid in advance. This is my condition. This is private, contractual relationship. So Mr. Shipper, I don't care about your Incoterm. All right. Basically, you pay me freight in advance. You are seller, you are buyer. If you are the seller, you can claim it from the buyer later or whatever. I don't care. Pay freight. So seller or buyer, whatever, to get goods shipped, pays freight in advance. So freight is paid, and bill of lading, and that's me 20 years ago. A banker, as a banker, I would say, hey, Mr. Beneficiary, your bill of lading shows freight paid, and letter of credit says freight collect. A beneficiary might cry, my God, I had to pay freight. I'm in trouble. Yeah, I paid in advance what I should not, and now I have discrepancy. Unfortunately, that's true. You have a discrepancy. LC wanted freight collect, you have freight paid. So discrepancy. So what to do with this? Seller should be careful about such a situation. If this is the case, of course, quickly I need amendment, and LC should say nothing about bill of lading. If the LC under FOB, you remember, if the LC says just bill of lading, nothing about freight, even under FOB, bill of lading could show freight paid, freight prepaid. It's not discrepancy. If the LC does not say freight collect and you have freight paid, then if it does not say, it could be prepaid, no problem. Of course, under ISBP, under our examination rules, if you have FOB, bill of lading shows freight paid, no problem on its own, unless LC wanted to collect. But your FOB invoice must not include freight to be included. So basically, if the seller paid freight in advance, he can possibly claim it from the buyer, but outside invoice presented under letter of credit. So we don't really care. Yeah. And sometimes actually it was paid by the buyer. You don't know. Yeah. Maybe buyer contracted for the carriage and he paid. So it does not necessarily mean a seller paid. So it can be no conflict with Incoterm whatsoever. Anyway, so remember this, FOB and bill of lading, freight prepaid, it's not a discrepancy on its own. Unless invoice lists freight for sea transport included in the price in invoice presented under letter of credit. So this is, I guess, practical issue highlighted. Most beneficiaries prefer with LCs CFR or CIF, and understandably, because they don't have the issues they would have with FOB, because here They contract for the carriage, good for logistics. They hand over the goods, they get them loaded, they get bill of lading, they ship the goods, risk passed to the buyer, they have the document. Freight prepaid, of course, in this case, no question about that. And they go to the bank and they should get paid, hopefully no discrepancies in other respect. We know where risk passes, but of course, if I say CFR, let's say CFR, I don't know, Colombo, Sri Lanka, contract NLC would certainly say what would be the port of loading. But if I say CFR Colombo, Colombo is destination to which contract for carriage is arranged by the seller, but it does not say where the risk passes, where goods are to be loaded. So most likely, contract would also specify the port of loading, basically where risk passes when goods are shipped on board. And when it comes to destination, it makes sense again to consider, instead of CFR Colombo port of discharge, maybe saying CFR Colombo terminal and so on, because this would be again pushing the seller to cover the cost till goods are delivered to that terminal. So otherwise, generally speaking, he can just cover I mean, goods just go to the port of discharge and that's it. And the place of destination where they are unloaded, whatever, would be up to the seller and his carrier. So if we want specific place of destination in that port of discharge, contract of carriage can possibly state this. And seller should make sure with its carrier that indeed a delivery would, I mean, goods will be shipped there. Unloading, unless paid under the contract of carriage, buyer would pay. With sea transport on liner terms, normal containerized shipments, usually, not always, depends on destinations, but usually it includes loading and unloading cost. Freight includes usually unloading cost as well. So carrier, port authorities should not charge the buyer for unloading charges if already paid by the seller under contract of carriage. If not paid by the seller, buyer will certainly pay. Of course, the other further handling charges and so buyer would be responsible for. All right, again, importance of for seller to notify buyer about shipment date, estimated time of arrival, so buyer has enough information to insure the goods and arrange for taking over of the goods in port of discharge. Basically, here it's very clear it must be, unless otherwise agreed, ship on board bill of lading. Buyer should really understand seller is not responsible for delivery to the destination. CFR Haiphong does not mean seller must deliver goods to Haiphong, but only load the goods in time. So buyer has the risk of transport delays and all that. Of course, he can possibly claim vis-a-vis carrier directly based on the transport document. CIF, it's like CFR plus insurance. So the same issues, the same comments, but we need to highlight that this Incoterm is indeed meant for bulk and break bulk heavy cargo, not for containerized shipments, despite the fact it is often used for obvious reasons. So the minimum insurance coverage, Institute cargo clauses C requirement has to remain here. Buyer should indeed consider higher coverage, asking seller in contract to arrange for Institute cargo clauses A or equivalent, and possibly strike clauses, even war clauses to cover additional risks. And again, important to consider other conditions of insurance, possibly sometimes higher coverage than 110%, maybe limiting possible exclusions, which might be in addition to normal exclusions under, let's say, ICCA. Maybe getting insurance not only to the port of discharge, but beyond to the buyer's warehouse. Sometimes buyers are even a bit worried about the insurance company to issue such a document. So they might actually fix this. They might say, Mr. Seller, you will insure the goods either with Allianz or this or that insurance company, not with anybody. So I'm not comfortable with any small or whatever insurance company. And also, of course, it might make sense to ask for insurance document to show survey agent to be in the country of port of discharge or so. But it does not make sense, as many LCs require claims to be payable in the buyer's country, claims agent to be in buyer's country. This is quite often impossible for the seller to fulfill, because many insurance companies, basically, they don't have payment claims agents in foreign countries. So if document says something like this, most probably it's not true anyway. And sometimes insurance companies really they say they put required information by the letter of credit on insurance document, but they kind of distance themselves from it. So insurance document says for LC purposes only, and they basically copy and paste the nonsense LC included, and then the other conditions of the insurance document actually are completely in conflict with that LC wording. So basically banks quite rightly refuse this. Just if the insurance document says for LC purposes only, and then basically insurance conditions don't cover it, they say something else, the document does not comply. Yeah? Many insurance companies, they develop this kind of practice, bad practice, just help their customers, beneficiaries to kind of evidently fulfill LC conditions, which is not right, and it does not fulfill LC conditions, because obviously the document does not state the conditions LC requires within the whole document as such. So you know, honestly, many LCs have a very wrong, impossible, silly, I'm afraid I can use that word, sometimes indeed silly conditions, which are completely against insurance practice. So beneficiary should consult insurance company when LC is given to their hands to double check that this is correct and would be fulfilled. So that's CIF, no change in the context of insurance coverage. So here we go. We have covered what was the plan for our session, and we have time for your questions and answers. So please raise them in the Q&A. part of our platform. Maybe a few kind of final remarks on Incoterms. ICC did a little research when this revision was to be done, which Incoterms are preferred by sellers and the buyers. And of course, depends on the regions and so on, but I think it gives us some clue. So you see a lot of sellers actually prefer FCA. That's kind of good news. And I would say generally you see sellers and buyers more and more use kind of, let's say, border terms, long Incoterms. You see either buyer will contract for the main part of the carriage, multimodal carriage, FCA, or seller is responsible for the main carriage like DAP. So it actually makes sense because it's more easier and cheaper if one party in developed, of course, environment arranges for the whole transport. It's cheaper, more controllable. You have one carrier responsible for the whole thing, one insurance for the whole thing. So it makes sense. When it comes to LCs, I would expect sellers to prefer more C terms. And that's what I see in Czech Republic. Most sellers prefer C terms. We ship the goods, but we don't want to have the risk of, let's say, international cross-sea transport. So when it goes by the vessel to the other continent, Czech exporters usually prefer C terms because too risky sea transport. I'm a bit surprised that sellers still, many sellers still very much prefer ex-works. And that's maybe a bit of misconception, or a lot of exporters are maybe newcomers, SMEs. So basically they don't want to do more, just placing the goods at the disposal of the buyer, not having experience and so on. On the other hand, a lot of buyers are very experienced and they have good carriers and so on. So they are quite happy to take over. And if there is no problem with customs on exporter side, ex-works can work for normal, not heavy goods or FCA. So it kind of seems more and more kind of buyers which take over the whole supply chain. All right, so that's just kind of comment on sellers' preferences and buyers. Of course, understandably, they would prefer D terms. Seller, you take responsibility for the whole thing, just-in-time delivery to my company or so. So more and more DAPs and DPUs are used. Or on the other hand, FCA when a buyer takes responsibility for the whole thing, having good detailed contractual conditions with their carriers. So it makes sense really to have this kind of long distance terms. FOB, I control the carriage. So generally, a lot of Czech buyers buying from overseas, they like F terms. FOBs or FCAs because they contract for the carriage, they control the game, they control the conditions, insurance, and all that. So it makes sense. And indeed, you see a bit of tendency to use more FCAs and DAPs on both sides. So these are my final remarks on this. I know a lot of participants, a lot of you, my dear friends, are bankers. So I wish to highlight, I've done a couple of books, and I did the book on examination of documents, and recently, based on my 7 editions of documentary credits and practice Czech language, I did English version, which is very popular. So you can have a look. This publication covers everything about LCs, issuance, importer side, Incoterms, documents, examination checklists, all is there. So you might have a look. I hope you would be interested. So let me look at your questions. There was one question about Incoterms and LC terms, so I will look at it and try to cover as much as I can. Freight collect, freight prepaid, applicable Incoterm. Yeah, generally speaking, of course, if you have a transport document under X works, you would expect freight collect, F terms, freight collect with the risk we highlighted, C terms and D terms. Transport is done by the by the seller, exporter. He does it at his own cost, at the risk of the buyer under C terms, or his own risk under D terms. So under C terms and D terms, transport document under a letter of credit quite rightly would always require freight paid, freight prepaid. One comment, at the end of the day, regardless of the Incoterm, all cost of seller will be incorporated in its selling price. Indeed, that's what I highlighted at the beginning of my presentation, when discussing who will do what, who will pay for that, who has the risk. So, of course, in the contract, they will discuss Incoterm, and the seller should, under each Incoterm, have detailed listing of the cost and risks, and maybe getting compensation. If you do more, like under D terms, you have more risk. Of course, your profit should include the kind of risk margin. So I'm sure for that risk and more arrangement, more your overheads cost, you will increase the price. But of course, sometimes seller might forget to include some cost. So then he cannot pass it to the buyer on the invoice unless there was, some variation allowed or so, which would not be most likely the case. Or sometimes, of course, we can estimate the cost incorrectly, or we have the risk the cost will increase. So imagine you have CIF. So you will fix your price and you will get the indication of the freight from your carrier. So maybe transport would be $2,000 and insurance would be 1,500. So you increase the price by 3,500 plus maybe $50 extra, cushion, whatever. But what can happen? You fix the contract, that's your price, that's your Incoterm, and then in a few weeks, months time, when you contract for the carriage, now you see that carrier requires, instead of $2,000, which was indication, not binding, now you see the cost is maybe 1,000 more. So you have that risk. You cannot pass it to the buyer. Your price was fixed. So in that case, of course, you are not always allowed to pass all the cost to the buyer in such a situations. Yeah. So I think generally buyer always pays, but with some exceptions as highlighted. So now a question was about Incoterm and standard clauses in LCs in MT 700 Swift message for LCs. So this is of course quite a wide question, requesting some possibly some examples. But let me see what I can do. So maybe I will share one LC I used for my seminar some time back. So maybe this can help me to highlight how Incoterms are reflected in LCs. So I hope you can see this PDF file, letter of credit, issued by very best bank of Cambodia, advised through my bank in Czech Republic, and how Incoterm is reflected. So Incoterm is commonly reflected in description of the goods. So you see field 45A, description of the goods and or services, and then you have description of goods like cars, spare parts, and so on. And it includes Incoterm CIF, Sihanouk, in this case, Incoterms 2020. LC usually, of course, includes this, unless it's delivery of services or Incoterm, which is unusual, is not included because they did not include this into the contract. This needs to be in the invoice. So we have rules, we have UCP, and we have also another publication, all reflected in that book I highlighted, ISBP, which has a couple of provisions which touch on this. So basically it says if the description includes Incoterm, the Incoterm must be reflected in the invoice. So this LC says Sihanouk, CIF, Sihanouk, Incoterms 2020. Invoice would have to say CIF, Sihanouk, Incoterms 2020. It would not be enough if it omits Incoterms 2020, or if it just says Incoterms without 2020. So it needs to be fully stated. If the LC says Incoterms, invoice can say Incoterms, or it can say Incoterms 2020 or even 2010. So additional information not requested by LC, not conflicting with the LC is allowed. And that's it. Basically, the other conditions depends how well parties agreed on documents in line with the Incoterm. So of course we know Incoterms as a bankers. So we, as highlighted, we would expect under ex-works parties agree on some delivery list or taking over protocol or transport document with all the risks for the seller or the buyer, as I highlighted, or inspection document. Yeah. Of course, sometimes parties agree on very conflicting problematic conditions. I've seen many times kind of ex-works, imagine ex-works, Prague, Czech Republic, inland, but then LC requested bill of lading. Crazy, eh? How a seller delivers in his own warehouse, and then he is supposed to present bill of lading, which matches FOB, or yeah, at least. And how seller can get the bill of lading if this is all arranged by the buyer? So he would have to kind of ask and wait for the bill of lading to be sent by the buyer to him. And why buyer should do that? Yeah. So either basically the ex-works they agreed in the contract was fundamentally modified by other conditions of the contract. Say basically they agreed on FOB or ex-works plus, converting their ex-works into FOB, or they had ex-works with very silly conflicting requirement for bill of lading, which completely goes against ex-works. Yeah. In this situation, so sometimes there is really bad use. They used ex-works only as a kind of price indicator, but then they, by other conditions, changed that term into something different, or they just made bad assumptions and having a recipe for disaster in written form. So be careful. So for instance, if we have FOB, oh, we have CIF. So CIF, what you would expect, you know, CIF is port to port. So correct LC would specify only port of loading and port of discharge. If you have CIF, it would be wrong. It would be really wrong if the LC shows place of receipt Praha, port of loading Hamburg or Bremerhaven, port of discharge Sihanouk. Because CIF is only port to port. So LC should specify only port to port. If it specifies in addition place of receipt, a place of final destination, basically it's multimodal transport. And then you should not have CIF, but you should have CIP, right? So you have CIF, you have port of loading, field 44E, and you have Sihanouk port of discharge. And then in line with the Incoterm, you would expect some documents. Generally, as I stated, always there would be invoice. This is always requested by Incoterm. And in addition, they most likely agree on packing list, most probably certificate of origin, sometimes some quality inspection certificate for obvious reasons. Sometimes it can be even mandatory requirement, which Incoterms say who should do. Yeah, inspection can be requested by country of import or so, pre-shipment inspection. So then LC should reflect this as well. So the key document is transport document. In case of CIF, no question. It must be shipped on board bill of lading. So LC should say bill of lading, can say full set, but does not need to. UCP says negotiable, basically means to the order. So we should, LC should, Incoterms don't say these details, but LC contract should say how bill of lading is to be shipped to the order, blank endorsed, notify applicant, name and address, contact details, and freight prepaid under CIF freight prepaid. And of course, as you know, UCP allows additional charges to the freight, but in this case, LC prohibits additional charges to freight. So here, basically, LC requires freight to include cost for loading and unloading. So unloading cost must be prepaid under the contract of carriage by the seller. Yeah, so they somehow, you know, fix this. What Incoterms otherwise say, if not paid by the seller, buyer will pay. But here they say, yeah, seller will pay. And not allowed to be, you know, charged to the buyer. Freight forwarders bill of lading not allowed. This condition is kind of redundant because it's not allowed anyway by UCP. Short form bill of lading not allowed. This makes sense. UCP allows short form bill of lading, blank form bill of lading. It allows bill of lading which does not have terms and conditions in small print on the back, only reference to them. But this LC actually prohibits this. Under Incoterm again, short form bill of lading would be generally allowed. Mark clean on board. This is not needed, and even our books say even if the LC says clean on board, it does not need to say clean. Yeah. So any transport document is clean unless there is clause which shows defective condition of the goods and or packaging. So that's how CIF is reflected, and of course insurance document. So CIF and CIP, LC should require insurance document. That's very common, yeah, because that's seller's obligation, beneficiaries. So here you have original of insurance policy issued for 110% of CIF invoice value, which means gross value of the goods, insurance against all risks. This LC is not really wonderful. It should prefer, they say, against I mean, including Institute Cargo Clauses A, because all the risk is kind of layman general description, not precise. Risks of strikes and wars to be also covered, makes sense. Claims payable in Cambodia, this might be problematic, as I said. Claims will not be paid in Cambodia by Cambodian insurance company or so. They will be just paid. Insurance companies, they pay to the insured party buyer by money transfer. So this insurance company in Czech Republic will get documents from the buyer if there was accident, and they will just pay him as instructed. Yeah. So you buyer, you don't need to be worried, and don't think that these insurance companies would have local agents which would make payments locally in local currency or something like this. Not at all. And address, name and address of the survey agent. Survey agent is assessor, the guy who, or lady, who will assess the damage and send a report to the insurance company to, to pay the damage. Irrespective of percentage, be careful as a seller, as a beneficiary. This will prohibit deductions, this franchisees and excess deductibles, which are otherwise allowed by UCP. Issue to the order and blank endorsed. Okay, so basically, insurance LC should require insurance document to be either showing insured party, the buyer, or maybe the seller, but being transferred, assigned to the buyer by endorsement on the back. So this is CIF. If it is FOB, it would be again not asking for insurance document, but otherwise asking for bill of lading, the same thing. If it is, let's say DAP, delivery to Phnom Penh, Cambodia, from Czech Republic, delivery from Praha, or maybe from Hamburg to Phnom Penh, DAP Phnom Penh, maybe dry port or so in Phnom Penh. Then, of course, DAP would be in the description of goods, and then letter of credit should require multimodal transport document. Or if it goes by air, airway bill, goods from airport in Praha to Phnom Penh airport, airway bill. Or if it goes by multimodal transport, goods received maybe in Praha, going through port of loading, maybe Hamburg, going to the Phnom Penh, maybe through Sihanoukville. We don't need to specify ports in the letter of credit in case of multimodal transport, which goes from the place of receipt to the destination. So basically, we know Incoterms well, we understand the documents and the risks, and not always, as you see, there are some limits. Not always documents fully reflect the delivery obligations of the seller under Incoterms. So the good example is, of course, D terms. DAP Sihanoukville or DAP Phnom Penh, Cambodia, seller must deliver goods to Phnom Penh, Cambodia. But the transport document will not show goods were delivered to Phnom Penh. The transport document only shows that carrier took over the goods from the shipper seller, maybe in Hamburg, and there was contract for the carriage of these goods to Phnom Penh. But if goods don't arrive, if document is presented and there are no discrepancies, bank would have to pay, despite the fact buyer might not get the goods. Of course, buyer outside the LC would have under the contract right to claim delays if goods were delivered late, if they were broken, for repairing them or replacing them. or money back plus damages for non-deliveries as the contract highlighted. So it depends, of course, how well we know Incoterms, how well we deal with the risks, which are sometimes kind of inherent and sometimes created by ourselves having conflicting terms. A few minutes we can we can of course spare more. So if you have any questions, please do. Does the issuing bank, I think I can answer live, right? Does the issuing bank have to specify if the Incoterm is 2010 or 2020? Generally, I would say banks follow instructions from their customers' buyers. So we would advise them, we would ask them, but if the buyer says just Incoterm, I would ask them, you guys, why you don't, in the contract, you did not say Incoterms 2020 or 2010? And, I would like to have some good explanation why, what would they agree if I see that my customer is not really knowledgeable or he underestimates risk. I would be a bit worried about, doing that business for them. But basically, bank is not to push to to specify terms and conditions in one particular manner. So depending on on circumstances, I can imagine that I would issue LC saying just Incoterms, but our customers, this would be very rare. Our customers, rightly as we tell them, as they learn from seminars, they really say always Incoterms 2010 or 2020. Okay, but on the other hand, I don't see how, I don't have any right to push them or whatever if it makes sense, or if their answer is kind of acceptable. So, I cannot say they must, but they should. This is the good practice. It shows they understand what they are doing. So I would expect my customers to say Incoterms 2020. If they say 2010, I understand they are still using the older book. Many customers still do, so not big surprise. If they don't include Incoterm or they say nothing, I would inquire. I would ask them why you don't. And depending on the answer, I would, most likely I would follow. But if I see LC with many, or application with many conflicting problematic conditions, of course, as a banker, I have right not to issue LC which is problematic. There will be problem with it. And it's also, as a banker, if I issue LC which does not make sense, it's also my LC, my obligation. I should understand my obligation. If I see this LC is not workable, it's wrong, it would be wrong to issue it, because this is my reputation risk, yeah, and maybe also compliance risk. So I would not say you have to, but you consider the consequences. So yes, it's very common to have it in applications and having this in MT 700 in description of goods. On the other hand, of course, you cannot develop your own conditions. If my customer does not say Incoterms, I would, as a banker, I would not add Incoterms 2020. Whatever I wish to be changed, I need my customer to change it and sign it. Yeah. So I hope it makes it makes sense. All right, excellent. So I have some nice comments and yeah, kind of appreciation that many banks might not be familiar with Incoterms 2020, and that's true. So I hope this seminar helped you to get familiar with with these issues and documentary requirements and the need to be knowledgeable and smart. As a banker, you need to know Incoterms, first of all, to advise and help customers to have successful business. And secondly, also for compliance. Yeah. Also, it's about risk. If my customer has contracts which does not make sense, which would be problematic to fulfill, my customer's risk is my risk. If my customer has problem, he cannot sell the goods or get the goods or whatever, he cannot repay my facilities, my loans. So basically, my customer is my counterpart. His risk is my risk indirectly. Yeah? Especially if I give a loan to exporter importer, I'm quite worried about his contract. Yeah, I mean, being not well designed. So certainly, I see banks are really knowledge knowledge centers, especially in developing countries, helping companies, SMEs, big way. But on the other hand, finally, it's a responsibility of the customer. So we have them, we advise them, they need to make decision. And we also sometimes might say, no, this LC, despite the fact it's your risk, you know, I'm not doing this because I'm giving you the loan. So it's my risk as well, or compliance or so. So one must kind of see what is the, there is some flexibility, but you need to know where is the red line. And this can be only built on experience. I hope you have learned a bit. And I would be very pleased. Certainly we will, I very much hope we will continue our fruitful cooperation with CACCI. I've started this cooperation 14 years ago. So indeed, thank wholeheartedly to CACCI for great support. Above all, to Wendy Young and Amador and Rado for long-term support and relationship